We are here to discuss or learn about Crip Spacetime. I'm so thrilled to have Margaret Price with us today. And as we settle in, I just want to offer some access invitations for this space. And I have this like kind of lengthy aside in my script for the introduction because like all good books, this book is one of those books that's in my head, and now it's kind of like impacting all of the ways I kind of look at my practice. So one of the epigraphs in the introduction is a quote from Kelly Fritsch, and it's pointing to the Edinburgh process being related to not just a zone for contact, but a place where you can attack something. So um, to go back to the access invitation move, I will clarify that this is an activity that we're doing in order to bring normative ways of gathering into contact with kinds of gatherings that we want to be cultivating here. Whether we want to characterize that as an opening for an attack, I'm not sure, but hopefully we can talk about that more. So please, in this space, feel free to get up, move around. You can leave and come back. You can go to the bathroom. You can stand to the side. All of these ways of being present are welcome here. If you're on the Zoom, please feel free to have your camera on and off, on or off. Feel free, if you have your camera on, to be joining from a comfy spot, to be having something to eat, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. We have captions today and we have ASL. If you're here in this space and you find that you're not actually in the spot you want to be in to use those access services, feel free to get up and move right now or throughout the time that we have together. If you're on Zoom, we think that we've figured out a way to have the interpreter and the speaker in the same camera. But if you notice that things are getting a little bit wonky, please let us know. We're happy to adjust. And if you would like to access the captions and you're on Zoom, you can navigate to the CC button in your Zoom controls and select Show Caption. We do have some access copies. This is a lovely offering that Margaret has ensured. They will be shared electronically, so you can hang on for those if you're in Zoom. And we do have some hard copies here in this space with at least a couple of large print copies. Would anybody like an access copy now for access purposes? Okay, they're on the back table if you're here in this space. All right. On Zoom, I have a couple of quick access notes. During the Q&A, please feel free to use the raise hand function or put something in the chat. We have our Associate Director, Nico, bridging the Zoom with the space. And I also want to make a note that we are recording this session just in case that changes how you'd like to show up in this space. And hello to the future. Anybody who's watching this as a recording from a different time in a different space. And then one final note for people here. I see a lot of you are masking. Thank you so much. We do ask that people mask to create a more safe environment for chronically ill and immunocompromised people in this space. And we have some masks on the back table if you'd like to take one of ours. And then finally, there are single user, all gender restrooms here in the Institute for the Humanities space. They are located to my left, to your right, through this opening in the wall. So feel free to take advantage of those if you'd like to. Okay, any adjustments that we can make before we continue? Anything from the Zoom, Nico? Okay, I'm seeing a no. All righty. So my name is Margaret Fink. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Disability Cultural Center here at UIC. I am a white woman. I have a mask kind of hanging off of the side of my face. I have long brown hair. I'm wearing a white sweater. And I want to start by thanking our co-host for this event, the Department on Disability and Human Development, And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute for the Humanities here at UIC, for helping us make this happen. Okay, and just to quickly introduce Margaret. Margaret Price is Associate Professor of English at Ohio State, where she also directs the Disability Studies program. Many of us here may know Margaret's work through Mad at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability in Academic Life. We may know and work with Margaret's essay, The Body-Mind Problem and the Possibilities of Pain. And the book we're here to learn more about together today extends a lot of this work. Mad at School takes a deep look at some of the animating logics and rhetorics of mental disability in academia, melding disability studies with critical university studies. And that book in particular gives us this great concept of chaotic spaces, which I might be mispronouncing. I'm looking over. Yes, thank you. Kairos, yes. So those are spaces where they're these informal, usually social spaces where individuals exchange power and knowledge. And in the Possibilities of Pain article, Margaret keeps thinking through the kinds of spaces we're navigating, and this time asks us to recognize that there can be more than one valid, true reality in a given space at a given time. She explores how we can be responsible to one another and offer care across such spaces. And maybe a lesser known space of knowledge production that Margaret has engaged with is convening Crip conferences and writing accessibility guides for academic conferences. That is where I personally first experienced what activist Mia Mingus calls access intimacy in a semi-public space with people I didn't already know. And it's where I first experienced relational disability culture versions of a gathering. And baked into all of this work is a commitment to what people living in Crip Spacetime know, whether that's a deep knowledge of what's not working at universities and beyond, or wisdom about what's possible, what we could be working toward. Okay, I know we all want to hear about Crip Spacetime, so please join me in welcoming Margaret Price.
Lie down. Thanks, buddy. This is Margaret Price speaking. I'll try to stop rubbing the microphone now. Sorry for those of you who just heard a lot of crackling. I'm going to try putting the mic on my attire and see if we're getting enough. Let's see. How's that for level of sound? Is the mic actually picking up for those in the room? If it's not picking up for those on the Zoom, I'm going to assume that someone who is seeing the Zoom will just let me know. Don't hesitate to interrupt me if there's anything that should be called to my attention. I get very excited, so I can be hard to interrupt. Don't be afraid to wave at me, vocally interrupt me any way that seems to make sense. Yes, all right. I had a couple of beginnings in mind, so I'm going to be starting in a couple of different places. First, as we begin, I want to acknowledge the ancestral and the contemporary territory of the place where I usually work. It's currently known by most people who work and live there as Columbus, Ohio. It is also the land of the indigenous people in the place where I live. So these include nations, including the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Seneca, Wyandot, and Cherokee. I talk about this because especially when talking about space-time as a concept, it's important for me to acknowledge the work that I do, not as a one-time thing, but as an ongoing practice to try to be a good guest of the land where I am one of the settlers. And that includes the land that we are inhabiting together today. I'm grateful to be in community with the Indigenous, American Indian, and Native scholars at Ohio State, who are my colleagues and friends. And I try to remember and act on the knowledge that acknowledging land doesn't just mean being accountable for history or saying one thing on a particular occasion, but also continuing to find ways to work in solidarity in the present. I'm also grateful to all of those who have helped make this visit possible. They include Ali Patsavas, Patsavas, Margaret Fink, and the Department of Disability and Human Development, as well as the Humanities Institute here at UIC. And I'm grateful to all of you for being here today. Thank you so much. The image on the cover slide is a meme, one of my favorites. It is a comic illustration of Batman and Robin. Robin is protesting, "My workload is unmanageable," while Batman is slapping him across the face saying, "Here's a well-being seminar." Now, this meme is one of dozens of images, photos, and funny moments that I've collected over the years in my ongoing attempts to illustrate what it feels like to be a worker in this particular time and place. By this time and place, I mean global austerity, late capitalism, the general hell in a handbasket vibes. While we are discussing the handbasket, I am going to go off script for just a moment. This is one of the worst weeks in my lifetime. I am a 55-year-old genderqueer and disabled person. And in some ways, this is also not one of the worst weeks of my lifetime. In some ways, this week is absolutely fucking routine. I want to speak in solidarity with all those who are seeing what is happening at this time. And I want to say just a couple of things. One thing I want to say from my vantage point, which began in the 1960s, barely, is that hatred of this kind is not new. It's not even particularly original. It may have changing faces. It may have different shapes than the ones that we have seen in the immediate past or the more decent past. What I want to say to you today is take heart. You may have a lot of capacity today to think about stuff and do stuff. You may have very little capacity. If you have capacity today, I encourage you to say to someone near you, I mean, I don't mean near you right this minute, but you can. Someone near you, just ask how they're doing. Again, as a genderqueer and queer and disabled person, I have been noticing today and over the last few days and over the last 55 years, that's really what I mostly want to hear. I just want to hear people who care about me, whether they know me intimately or don't know me well at all. I just want to hear that they were interested to know how I'm doing. There are many other larger forms of organizing that we must take part in. There are many ways that we must be angry. And today, please make no mistake, I am angry as fuck. But I also want to remind all of us in the spirit of today's talk, which is largely about collective accountability and access, the beginning of our efforts can be the willingness to say to one another routinely and with willingness to hear the answer, how are you doing? If you're using the script, I am now going to return to the script. I am moving to kind of the middle of page 2, where the subhead says, what does access mean? And I forgot to say this part, so I will say it now. If you would like to access this copy on my website, the URL is Margaret Price, all one word, .wordpress.com. So you can go to that website. Again, it's Margaret Price, all one word, .wordpress.com. Go to the presentations tab, and the Word document that I'm holding a printout of right now is available there at the top of the page. So that's what I'm reading from, and that's where we'll be starting from today. I will be speaking for approximately 35 minutes, 35 to 40, and then we'll have time for questions. To affirm and lift up something Margaret Fink said, please do treat this time we have together as time that hopefully will be as accessible for you as possible. Of course, there are always hard limits to that. But if you wish to move around, get some food, I tried that cheese, it's really good. Perhaps confer with a neighbor, be on your phone, knit. I don't know if we want to lie on the floor today because it's kind of salty and gross. Maybe sit on the floor. If there's an extra place to put your feet up, feel invited to do that. All these forms of engagement are welcome. And in the spirit of my own announcement, I'm going to stop standing so stiffly. I'm a little bit nervous. I'll stretch myself out a little bit. All right. So what does access mean? The mic. Margaret, do you know how to advance the slides? Or does any magical person know how to advance the slides? That's the one I tried. Oh.
What it's doing is that it's registering the Zoom and to now try to advance.
Oh, thank you.
Zoom pops up, it's gonna register that it's.
I got it.
PowerPoint anyway.
Relatable. Thank you so much. All right. So when I think about access in academia, I usually start from my own experiences. I myself work from the minoritized position of a disabled genderqueer faculty member, but also from the privileged position of a white faculty member with tenure. I arrived at my current school, Ohio State, in 2016 after teaching at a small liberal arts college, Spelman College, for 12 years. Now, Spelman is a small, private, historically black college for women. Ohio State is a gigantic, public, predominantly white research university. To say that change was a shock is an understatement. I effectively went to the opposite of Spelman College. So my transition in early 2016 was extremely difficult. However, a funny thing about the story to me, as I attempted to tell it back to myself years later, and as I attempted to tell other people what happened to me when I arrived at Ohio State, it was really hard for me to figure out for some time. Now, during my hiring process at Ohio State, I talked candidly about my disabilities, and I continued to talk about them after I arrived on campus. At no point did anyone actually ask me about my access needs, either through formal or informal channels. But I do want to emphasize that the atmosphere was not at all unwelcoming or hostile. Rather, in classic Midwestern fashion, people would often say to me, just let us know if you need anything. So I felt generally deeply welcome, and specifically deeply unclear on exactly what form this welcoming might take, especially if I were in need of something other than very targeted advice, like using the copier, or general goodwill, which I did have in abundance. Everyone was glad I was there. Yes, what's up?
Take a pause really quick. Can I ask you to move a tiny bit closer to the podium so that you are on screen?
There you go.
Got it?
A little bit.
Oh, good, excellent,
We good? Awesome, thank you.
wonderful. Now, the support that I had, although it was abundant, was not enough to get me through that first semester. I had just moved from Atlanta. I was attempting to navigate dozens of doctor's appointments with new caregivers. I was trying to figure out Ohio State's healthcare infrastructure and trying to manage my own increasing debilitation. 4 months after my arrival, one of my doctors abruptly sent me to the emergency room in an ambulance. After several days in the hospital and yet more meds, I was sent home. Shortly after that happened, I went to see the ADA coordinator at Ohio State. His name is Scott Lissner, Lissner. Interestingly, the agenda of our meeting was not the fact that I had just been hospitalized or any accommodations I might need. In fact, I didn't know at that point that the person in charge of faculty and staff accommodations at OSU is Scott. I was actually there to see him because I was the director of disability studies and we had some business to attend to. However, on that particular day, when I finally found his building, another thing that happens right after you move, you can't find anything. On that day, I desperately needed help. I was on the point of breakdown and I was afraid to admit it. Scott kindly asked me how I was doing. And although I didn't know this was going to happen, I burst into tears. And I said something like, I don't know what to do. I am failing at this job. It was a tremendous stroke of luck. And again, a significant stroke of privilege that Scott not only is a very kind person, but he also happened to be the one responsible for helping faculty with disabilities. So I happened to be in exactly the right place at the right time. On that day, we did not attend to whatever business we had at hand. Scott instead spent the time helping me figure out what accommodations I would need and putting them into place. Now, what's most striking to me about this story is not that I fell through the cracks of the many services available at Ohio State. Of course, that happens all the time. What really strikes me is that a person could hardly have been better resourced, more knowledgeable, or simply more talkative about disability and access than I was when I arrived at Ohio State. I literally wrote the book on it. Furthermore, I had already been teaching at colleges and universities for over 20 years. I am tenured, I am white, English is my first language, I'm familiar with the landscape of academia, and at the time I went to see Scott, I had just been welcomed enthusiastically into my job. And yet, there I was, crying, fresh out of the hospital, trying to struggle through, and on the point of quitting. For the longest time, I could not figure out why that would happen. And I also was deeply aware that someone not in this singularly advantaged position that I had been in would not have made that hair's breadth escape from washing out or dying. Sarah Ahmed, Ahmed, is a feminist philosopher, and she says the following about the concept of welcoming. Quote, to be welcomed is to be positioned as the one who is not at home, end quote. That point has always resonated with me, especially given our fondness in academe for welcoming one another into various spaces. I think I may have welcomed you all at the beginning of my talk today. Now, to Ahmed's idea, I want to add another one from Tanya Tichkosky, spelled Tichkoski. Tichkosky writes of what she calls the unimagined type, that is, the person who is reproduced as excludable. So for Tichkosky, the unimagined type is the person in academic life who has not yet arrived, but who will be welcomed when they do arrive. For example, if someone who uses a wheelchair shows up, then we will put in a ramp. If someone who prays 5 times a day appears, then we will think about where and how they might have a space to do that. In my own first semester at Ohio State, like so many of us, I was an unimagined type. But, and here, this is the big idea that I think is really what gave rise to the book Crip Spacetime. The failure of imagination that Tichkosky describes was not perpetrated by anyone in particular. It was not the work of some individual evildoer. It was systemic. It was all around me. It was part of me. A powerful feat of imagination is required in order to go beyond passively welcoming disability or any minoritized position, and instead actively expecting it. In fact, actively understanding that we, are already here. Allie, I forgot my water, I think. Is it sitting next to my, thank you. I'm really tied down. I'm like standing on the leash. I'm holding the lav mic so I don't blow it out. No, I'm good. Thank you. I'm going to talk now about that study, the disabled academic study, which is sort of the main content of the book, Crip Spacetime. And some of this will be very nerdy methodology stuff, which I'm happy to talk more about during Q&A, or ignore as if it had never been mentioned, depending on your preference. So the disabled academic study was launched quite a long time ago in 2012 as a collaborative effort between rehabilitation psychologists, rhetoricians, that's me, and disability studies specialists, also me. We began with an anonymous survey, which yielded 267 complete responses. For specific reasons, we only counted complete responses to this survey. Again, I'm happy to talk more about all I learned about quantitative research during Q&A. It will not take long. Over 100 people volunteered for interviews, and 38 interviews were eventually completed. In order to ensure that our methods were accessible for interviewees and disabled researchers, our interviews took place in a wide variety of modes. These included face-to-face, video conference, telephone, both with and without interpreters, instant message chat, and email. Some interviews were oral, some were signed, and some were a mix. We also worked with interpreters, captionists, and/or vocal assistants at various times, both remotely and in person. At several interviews, my service dog was also present. Otis's predecessor, who some of you know, her name was Ivy, IVY. Now, the interviewees and the interviewers on this study all identify with a wide range of disabilities, including sensory, physical, and mental disabilities, as well as chronic illnesses. Our sampling approach for this study is formally called maximum variation sampling. That is, we were seeking as diverse a group of participants as possible. The purpose of doing this is not to gain a representative sample or say what is typically true of a particular group. So I emphasize this because it's a common misconception about this study. It's a large study, but it's not meant to be a representative study. Representative studies have a very important purpose, and it's a specific purpose. But if you're using a maximum variation sample, also sometimes known as a diversity sample, hopefully we're still allowed to say that in a few months. If you're using a diversity sample, the purpose is to work mostly with what conventional research would call outliers. And so you're looking for richer data, longer stories, things that don't seem to fit together at first. And the reason you do this is in part to gather those rich, detailed kind of data, but also to be able to ask better questions. If you're only studying so-called representative populations, you'll always have ongoing research questions that sort of fit within those guardrails. So the reason to use variation sampling is to allow your research questions to go outside the guardrails as well. Ideally, this all works together beautifully, and quantitative and qualitative researchers never make fun of each other's methods. Sometimes we do, though. So this yielded a very large amount of data, which I spent many years analyzing. And along the way, I noticed something that eventually became a major finding of the study. Disabled academics often seem to inhabit a different reality than their non-disabled colleagues. Or to put that a little less dramatically, a disabled academic's everyday life and choices might be extraordinarily hard to understand from a non-disabled point of view. So, for example, interviewees would describe grappling with common sense questions like, why didn't you just ask for help? Or why don't you just explain the problem? Or the ever popular, why are you so angry? Interviewees struggled to explain, even to themselves, the nature of the barriers they faced. The barriers were not just hidden or invisible, they were somehow deeply obscure, baffling to us all. Their impact was deep and complicated, going far beyond the simple need to install a ramp or extend the time for a task. This different reality is what I came to call Crip Spacetime. Now, one of my ways of attempting to show the complexity of Crip Spacetime was to create drawings and diagrams to illustrate what participants were describing. The next slide is of one of the diagrams that I developed, and I should give credit to Jonna Keller, my spouse, who co-designed the book's diagrams with me and also made them look much better than my napkin drawings. So the diagram on the screen now is what I call the accommodations loop. It illustrates the movement of time from disabled employees' point of view. The shape is of an infinity sign, which looks like a figure 8 turned on its side. And there are several points along this loop, this sort of double-ended loop, which show different things happening. In the upper left of the diagram are the words slow system. So we know that the system of access and accommodation in academe typically moves at a slow pace. However, at the bottom of this same loop on the left is what often happens for disabled workers, which is that they have a time-sensitive need. It might be time-sensitive in the sense of, I am teaching my class next week. We need to get this accommodation figured out by next week and for the rest of the semester. Or it might be time-sensitive in the sense of, I am standing in my classroom and something's not working. Or I am in my working environment and it's so hot, I know I'm going to have a seizure. So it could be time sensitive in an extremely immediate way, or sometimes it's time sensitive in the sense of, I need to get my semester planned right now. And the particular temporality of academia, I think, really adds to this. We are so often in that hurry up and wait mode where nothing is possible, and then suddenly we have to get everything organized for this semester in like a few days. Now, on the right-hand side of the diagram are some of the things that occur, according to interviewees, when one is traversing the accommodations loop. One very common approach that was described to interviewees is that they would use their own resources in order to cut through a delay. So they would pay for their own assistant, for example, or they would purchase equipment on their own dime. One person described bringing her husband to academic conferences. Not only, this is one of the interesting things about her story to me, she not only brought her husband with her to conferences because her university would not pay for a sighted guide, but also because even a sighted guide would not have been a lot of help to her. She needed someone who would perform subtle tasks like helping her get in and out of conversations with sighted people. So it wasn't just a matter of, okay, what sessions are you going to? What rooms do you need to find? Let's make it happen. She needed someone to really perform a subtle skill of accompaniment with her. And so she and her husband simply decided they would pay for him to go for all her conferences, and they would also pay for childcare. Also on the right-hand side of the accommodations loop is a very common phenomenon, which is emotional cost resulting from delays, self-accommodating, et cetera. And then at a break in the accommodations loop are the words, employee may leave job. A fairly large percentage of people that we interviewed did end up leaving academe. In one memorable instance, a tenured professor left her tenured job and left academe altogether, just due to the sheer stress of trying to navigate accommodations. So that's the overview of the study. And as kind of the last section of the talk, I'd like to get more specific about the stories that I learned and relate some stories from participants in the study. The first participant, I'm trying to remember if I'm talking about one participant or two participants. Oh, I think just one. Today, we will just be listening to and learning about one participant whose pseudonym is Jackie, spelled Jacky. Jackie chose her own pseudonym, and she also guided us on how to describe her. She is a blind woman of color working at a large public university. Her experiences help give life and clarity to the more abstract image of the accommodations loop and the larger pattern of data that we can discern from the larger numbers and survey in the study. If you're using the script, I am now near the bottom of page 5. When Jackie arrived at her first year as a professor, her first job as a professor, her school was slow to provide the accommodations she needed. The accommodations that she requested were a reader, that is, a sighted person to read inaccessible material out loud, a type of screen reading software called JAWS, and a scanner. Although Jackie's supervisors kept saying they were working on her accommodations, weeks and months passed by. This is how she described the situation. And I'm now going to read a quote from Jackie verbatim off the slide. First year was really like, in that sense, shaky. Like I did not have a reader when I came. I did not have assistive technology. I just came and straight away I had to start teaching. I had to look for the reader. I had to put the ads for it, interview people. And for 1 or 2 months, I did not have a reader, either JAWS or this. Thankfully, I taught one course, but that meant like I bought so many of my courses just to accommodate myself. Now, what does I bought my courses mean? It essentially means what is informally in academia referred to as a course buyout, or not having to teach one of your courses for a specific period of time. So all the tenure track faculty at Jackie's school received 8 courses against a 3-3 load. So the idea was you're coming in as a junior faculty member, you're ordinarily teaching 3 courses in the fall and 3 courses in the spring. You will get 8 releases in your first 5 years that you can distribute as you see fit. And this additional time is meant to allow you to prepare your tenure case, get your packet ready, do the research you need to do, stuff like that. So the first reader that Jackie hired, she described as wonderful and said she made sure everything was accessible. However, that very first reader left the institution after a brief time. And at that point, Jackie reported, quote, everything was stalled, end quote. Jackie was left with no in-person reader, and she still didn't have a screen reader. She didn't have the software called JAWS yet. So she used up half of her course buyouts in her first 3 semesters. At that point, Jackie said she realized that she couldn't go on as she had been. So she appealed to her department chair for help. She asked for extra course releases to make up the ones she had used while self-accommodating. The first thing she received was apologies. And here again, I'm quoting from Jackie, reading verbatim off the slide. My chair knew, everybody knew that accommodations got delayed and all that, and they kept apologizing. Oh, we're so sorry about it. We're so sorry about it. I said, wait, like sorry does not solve anything. I'm literally, halfway through with my course releases, and it's my 2nd year. And then chuckling a little, she said, then the whole bargaining started. The apology is a common theme in the accommodations loop. Apologies are routinely offered along with harmful delays. Jackie's succinct response, which was, sorry does not solve anything, points out that apologies do not redress the actual harms occurring. Now, her story shifts at this point to a series of exhausting and sometimes insulting discussions about what accommodations would be adequate. This is what she meant by bargaining. So in this part of the accommodations loop, The disabled employee is often asked to prove that they are disabled, or how badly do they really need the requested accommodation? This is a question of time in a different way. How much is the loss of time actually affecting the employee? And by affecting, the counter bargainer does not mean how much pain is it costing you. Rather, they mean how much is it affecting your productivity on the job. So Jackie recounted extensive conversations during her second year. These conversations took place between multiple administrators and staff at her institution. And here again, I'll be reading verbatim off the slide. There's a little interjection from me as interviewer in the middle. Jackie. So back and forth between the dean and the provost and the dean and and they were like, the second year was full of all this drama. And I was not in any of these meetings, but I got to hear a lot of nasty things from the provost and like from the administration. Like, first of all, they said, like, I'm being too needy and demanding. At this point, I said, really? Jackie said, yeah, too demanding. They were like, her needs never get over. Like, she wanted a scanner, $1,700 scanner. We got it. She wanted the second reader. We got it. She got it. Now she wants course releases. She doesn't want to teach, end quote. Jackie was not called needy or demanding to her face. Rather, an ally in the Office of Diversity reported it back to her. The reporting back was not, of course, in an effort to hurt her, but to note that the administration was being, quote unquote, nasty, and to say, we're going to have to advocate extra forcefully. They are saying nasty things. Jackie said that this process not only delayed her work even further, but carried significant emotional cost. She said, quote, I was in tears. I was in tears, end quote. In fact, during her interview, Jackie cried again, recalling the pain of these events. And as the interviewer, I cried as well. Now, at this point in Jackie's story, the administration began to discuss granting the course releases. However, they insisted that the releases be awarded on the basis of low productivity, rather than calling them an accommodation. This introduced a temporal paradox into the loop. Jackie was asked to sign a form stating that she would be granted the course releases because she had not been productive enough, despite the fact that she had already obtained 3 grants in her first 2 years. Jackie refused to sign and consulted with her chair. This is one of my favorite parts of the interview because Jackie's chair, who was a strong ally, gave some really classic academic advice, which was just ignore it. So here I'm quoting directly off the slide from Jackie. I was like, okay, what should I do? I don't want to sign. My chair's like, just forget about it. Don't sign it. Just fizzle it. Let it fizzle away. I had asked for 5 course releases. They gave me 2, and then they said, we will review the request for the other 2 course releases next year, depending on if you do these things, end quote. Now, Jackie's story, I should say, is not an unusually horrible or lurid one. Numerous other people in the study told stories about being taken through similar bends and twists while attempting to gain accommodations. Jackie had an outstanding work record, but she was met with a double-bind response. If you need accommodations, you must be able to show that you are performing poorly. P.S. Students will also recognize this bind. But then poor performance means you're not a competent employee, and thus you should not receive benefits such as course releases. This paradoxical logic has a clear purpose. In Jackie's case, as she noted herself, the institution wanted to avoid admitting that they had not complied with their obligation to accommodate her adequately. Numerous other interviewees in the study reported being caught in a similar paradox. The interviewee whose pseudonym is Iris had one of my favorite ways of summing this up. She described it as follows, quote, it's like, I have to explain what's happening that's difficult, and then explain how great I'm doing anyway. And I kind of rhetorically move back and forth, end quote. Jackie was not asked to prove she was blind, nor to take a vision test. However, many interviewees reported being asked to do just that, demonstrate or certify their disabilities in specific ways, and be vetted by specific authorities. This is a process that Ellen Samuels theorizes as biocertification. And that word is spelled BIOCERTIFICATION, biocertification. Some interviewees were forced to obtain letters from their doctors, obtain expensive tests, and others proactively sought documentation in an effort to avoid at least part of the accommodations loop. Unfortunately, depending on specific circumstances, an employee's disability may still be disbelieved, either in its specific effects or even the fact that it exists in the first place. This is the last little bit that I want to share with you today, and this points toward the next work that I'm trying to do. In a way, the whole book, Crip Spacetime, is just kind of a big bummer. And it also describes phenomena that are very familiar to many of us. Whether we are disabled or minoritized in other ways, Crip Spacetime is not exactly a revelation. Sometimes while I was working on the book, I felt as though I was spending years of my life and asking readers to take hours and hours of their time to read the gritty, painful details of a phenomenon that most of us live anyway. But in part, I felt it was still important to write and publish the book because the documentation is needed, the sense of not being alone is needed, and those specific textures of the ways that access paradoxes play out in real life are needed. And I also was hoping that ultimately these stories would point me towards somewhere new. The somewhere new that they pointed me is the idea of collective access. Collective access and gathering, I have firmly come to believe, are the only sustainable ways forward, not only for academia, but perhaps for any kind of institution or gathering that we might try to endeavor to be a part of. And so I just want to say a couple of things about collective access and how I'm imagining it, and then we'll wrap up for questions. Oh, that's not where I wanted to be yet. Well, we're there now. Now, just to quickly define collective access, it arises through a shared sense of accountability in a given space-time. Oh, and if you're on script, I'm in the middle of page 9. This space-time could be a classroom, a department, a whole university, and of course, it is constantly unfolding and being adjusted. This is the tough thing about access, and more broadly, equity generally. They are not tasks. They are not something we can take on and finish. And as a Virgo, it is very hard for me to stop asking, how do I make collective accountability happen? It is not something that you can make happen, that anyone can make happen. It arises, it unfolds. So what I'm trying to learn more about now in my next project is, what is that unfolding? Can we recognize it? Can we even learn to foster it? So that brings me to the visual that's on screen now, which is something I've been playing with for a few years. It will shortly be published in a book titled Feminist Making. It's a still image on the slide, but I like to think of it as being dynamic. And it's meant to illustrate the way that access unfolds as an ongoing and collective process. It roughly describes a triangle, 3 lines set at angles to each other. And at the 3 points are the words novicehood or newness. That's 1 point. A second point is expertise or experience. And a third point is intimacy. These 3 points, which I like to imagine as moving dynamically, maybe changing the shape of the triangle, maybe even coming out into an additional dimension. These together are how I imagine access unfolding. Expertise is important because it represents experience, study, and knowledge. Expertise, for example, could center on history, building standards, pedagogical skills, ancestral knowledges, or the lived experience of what it's like to be in a particular position. Novicehood is important as well. It's from the position of being a novice that we are able to ask baseline questions, critique established norms, and derive the energy to learn new things. And intimacy, as I'm sure many of you know already, I am drawing from Mia Mingus, M-I-N-G-U-S, a disability studies scholar and activist who coined the term access intimacy. And the last slide that I'd like to share today is a quotation from Mingus about what access intimacy is. I'm reading verbatim off the slide with a quote from Mingus. Access intimacy is that elusive, hard to describe feeling when someone else gets your access needs. The kind of eerie comfort that your disabled self feels with someone on a purely access level. Sometimes it can happen with complete strangers, disabled or not, or sometimes it can be built over years. It could also be the way your body relaxes and opens up with someone when all your access needs are being met. So as far as I've gotten on my new idea is that I think access unfolds somehow at this intersection. One way to foster that unfolding, which is one of the things I'm trying to think about, how do we foster the unfolding, is to recognize the expertise you already have, but also recognize what is new to you and value that as well. Notice the intimacies that arise for you, and notice the ones that you already have and that you're already using as touchstones and scaffolds for your everyday life. Creating a collective and relational sense of access requires slowness. It requires conversations, reflection, and sitting together with questions that may seem unanswerable, maybe just are unanswerable. Again, as a Virgo, I hate that. You have already started those conversations. I am not coming here and telling you something new, but I hope today we can continue that conversation and use this as a point for continuing further. There is no set design for access in academe, but what we do know is that this is an ongoing project and it is all our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm going to just give us maybe like 3 minutes while I do a sound check, change off of this, give Margaret a beat, and then we'll transfer into Q&A. There's a couple of things to note with Q&A. We're going to ask everybody to use the microphone. So give me a minute. If you have a question that I will bring, or someone will bring the microphone to you. If you folks are on Zoom, please feel free, if you haven't done so already, to put your question in the chat. I'd actually like to start with you guys to make sure that you have a chance to join the conversation. Again, there's some food in the back, so feel free as we transition over to take a minute to grab some. Okay, wonderful. So we are going to open it up for the Q&A. One thing I do want to note is we are continuing to record during this conversation. Just let us know if you would prefer us to not keep your question in the in the actual recording. We will remove the question, keep the response. So you can either let us know at the beginning of your question, or you can let us know afterward and we will sort it out. And by we, I mean the Disability Cultural Center. Thank you. I'm gonna go to the first Zoom question, but be ready, folks in the room. I will come back to you. So Michelle asks, how do we get from unimagined to imagined? Is that the goal beyond collective access? Larger structural changes.
Thank you, Michelle, for that question. I would revocalize it as, I think I actually perceived, that was me stepping on Otis. I think I perceived two things in this question. One is, what would it mean to move from being the unimagined type to the imagined type? And then a related part of that question I'm perceiving as, what about doing this in a larger way? And I think these are both really, just really important things to think about. In terms of moving from the unimagined type to the imagined type, one way of doing that is increasing our intimacy, telling stories, collecting stories, thinking about ways that we can access the richness of each other's experiences, knowledges, perceptions. And that has always felt really important to me, perhaps increasingly so now, since it's just so hard to find time to really pay attention to the richness of others' experiences. Or maybe what I mean is it can be hard to find the attention. It can be hard to find the capacity. And that process, of course, as Michelle's question indicates, is a critical part of making change at larger scales. One thing that's been on my mind a lot as I have been arriving at and exploring this notion of collective accountability is that I have quite a number of examples of collective organizing and collective workplaces on smaller scales. Some of the stories are actually in Crip Spacetime. Specific workplaces, for example, specific departments or programs where people had worked out a really interdependent, shared way of doing their work and gathering together. But it's really hard to find examples of that happening at larger scales. Now, one question that may arise at this point is, do we need it? To have, like, do we need a country, for example, to operate in the same way that a small interdependent group of researchers might? I'm not sure. One of the humbling things about trying to do this research is that I keep bumping up against my own limits, just as a person who uses certain methods. I don't know much about, for example, public health. I don't know much about large-scale sociological or geopolitical moves. But I do think that one issue with the question of scale is to, again, pay attention to what we might be trying to make happen as opposed to what we are willing to observe already happening. So if we're, I think one thing about trying to think about collectivity at scale is maybe that's kind of a round hole, square peg question. Or maybe what we think of as collectivity occurring at a smaller scale might transform entirely in a larger organization or across a larger span of time. So I have no set answer for what the scales might look like, but I do think that we really have to be willing to observe the places where things are already happening and try to get away from the idea of creating something new or making something happen.
I'm going to try to see if this microphone works to catch on captioning. Excellent.
I don't think there's any more Zoom questions. I just
Lovely.
the open access.
Great. Thank you so much. So if there's anybody in the room that has a question, please signal to me in a way that is, thank you, comfortable. I will bring the microphone.
Thanks, Margaret. My name is Jennifer. I really liked your figure 8. And of course, access is ongoing and never ends, and the need to negotiate one's access needs never ends. But I also noted that your vignettes, your personal story and Jackie's story, really focused on these moments of transition when you're new in a job. And I'm also thinking here of some of my neurodivergent students who have had a much harder time with job interviews and the kind of panic I feel about not being able to run around to the other side and enculturate, the colleagues who they're interviewing with and explain things more and provide more context in a softer landing. And, just something I really, really think about a lot. And I'm wondering if you could say something about like those really intense, like critical moments, or like whether there are those really intense moments like with transition or other times that you identified. Are there's kind of really high pressure um, points of passage over a career? And is that kind of a part of what comes out in the book? I'm sorry, I'm not being articulate.
No, I think that question makes a lot of sense to me anyway. Jennifer, thank you so much. Academic temporality is particularly weird because it contains so many transitions and so many new starts. So those of us who are in academia in some way, as a student, a staff member, a faculty member, we are constantly restarting. A different classroom, a different space. You're moving from place to place to place throughout the day. You're encountering new people. There's just this endless sort of pattern of resets, which you're absolutely right. I think for some of us that feels really invigorating and interesting. And for some of us, it's just really hard. It's like being constantly in transition or constantly having to re-win people over, constantly reacculturate. The other thing that I thought was really that you picked up on in your question that was actually a big part of Crip Spacetime is the intensity that those transition brings. I have worked in 9-to-5 jobs, for example. I've worked in workplaces with fewer transitions, and it is not like an academic workplace where you are just constantly undergoing the emotional intensity of those shifts. So there are two codes in the study that particularly speak to this. One code is mobility. There are all kinds of ways in which being disabled will make you more and less mobile, not only in a literal sense, but make it more difficult to, for example, move to a new class, move to a new city, move to a new system of doing things. And the other code that comes to mind is something I ultimately called a body-mind event. And I now realize it's probably not coincidental that as I'm thinking back on it, kind of going through interviews in my mind, I know that this code was inspired by a neuroatypical interviewee. And if I went back and looked at my data, I suspect that those of us who are neuroatypical would be people who are very, very familiar with the body-mind event. So I had some trouble defining body-mind event. I had a sense of what it was, but I didn't have a strong definition for it as a code. And I ultimately defined it as a sudden change in circumstances in your having to do with your body-mind. So it could be a meltdown, it could be a panic attack. It could just be discovering that the classroom you have to teach in is way too hot. And you're starting to lose your cognitive capacity and you're going to have to leave immediately. So the body-mind event, again, it was something I recognized long before I quite had language for it, but I think it's something that is particularly recognizable in high drama, high transition workplaces or just spaces like academe. Because if you are someone who does not respond well to being surprised, or being stressed out, or just having a lot of different voices going at the same time, you are more likely to get to the point of something, for example, like a meltdown, or a physical event that is really hard to recover from. So in my short answer to your question is, yeah. The questions of intensity, transitions, and mobility were a huge part of the study. And one of the reasons why I did analyze these data for so many years is there was so much to learn, but sometimes it took me a long time to figure out what I was learning.
Thanks, Ari. Thank you. This is Michelle. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really struck by something that you said on the beginning of your talk, which is, and I'm reading from the Access copy. You say, a disabled academic's everyday life and choices may be extraordinarily hard to understand from a non-disabled point of view, and that's a really strong and also bummer of a statement, as you said. And I guess I'm wondering, I understand that you're moving on from there to saying, okay, we can move to collective access, but how do we get then from this lack of understanding, this idea that this is not intelligible to people, to collective access? Like, it seems like there's a thing there that needs to be there. And so that was my question, like, what is that thing, that moves you from unintelligibility to collective access? Like, what's that gap? And then the other question is, what then is the role of the institution? Because it seems like when you're talking about collective access, you're not talking about institutional access and accommodations. And so I'm wondering what you think of that.
Thank you so much again, Michelle. I think you're pointing to like just really the core questions. So ironically, I think the first one is a little easier for me to answer because that's exactly what I've been pondering is, okay, I see collective accountability there, over there, I'm not the person who thought of this. Like, I'm following Black feminist thinkers. I'm following indigenous epistemologies. Like, collective accountability is something that offers a more sustainable way of being together. But here we are in this place of unintelligibility. The diagram I showed at the end, to some degree, is part of my thinking on how we might get there from here. We have to have the expertise and lived experience, the ability to share the richness of our experiences with each other, the ability to think about them with care and with different methods. We have to have newness, the willingness to ask questions that haven't been asked before. And of course, I think the intimacy might be the closest thing to like the one glue that one points to. The way one becomes not baffling is to be intimate with others, with environments, with histories, ancestors, with possible futures, with lands. All these forms of intimacies are how we become more intelligible. And that's not a casual question to me. I was not only a disabled kid, but I was a mentally ill kid, a kid who really did not make sense to the people around me. Even people who loved me very much were really, I think, mostly able to perceive only anger and lack of sense from me. And so from my very youngest experiences, I have been struggling with the question of what it means to be not just misunderstood, but not understandable. That's probably why I'm in rhetoric. So yeah, that's what I'm playing with now is that triad of experience, newness, and intimacy. The role of the institution, man, I don't know. I might have given you a different answer 5 years ago. Speaking of the hell in the handbasket, Ohio is looking like crap right now. But one book I do quote a lot, and that gives me a sense of like, why am I sticking around? You know, working more as a reformer in academe than as a revolutionary. And the answer is, in large part, to me, gathering. So the book, The Undercommons by Fred Moten, Moten, and Stefano Harney, Harney. It's a very famous book. It's sort of a slim book of philosophy. A lot of us kind of carry it around and sleep with it under our pillow. And one of the things that Moten and Harney say about academia is that it serves as a place for gathering. They don't use the term gathering, they use the term study. And study they define not necessarily as studying a book, but being together. And they have this beautiful description of it that goes something like walking and talking together, learning together, eating, hanging out. To me, that's a really key part of what they call study, just hanging out. This is where organizing and change occurs. It's not the only place where organizing and change occurs. We need organized organizing. We even need policy. Maybe in some ways, we even need some forms of government. But that open space where we engage in study, that's one of the things that academe offers. And it's, I think, one of the things that I still think we have to keep making use of and keep fighting to be a part, have it be a central part of academe.
I have relocated. There is a Zoom question. Amazing. And then we probably have time for 2 more questions. So I want to make sure that I haven't ignored anybody in the back who is maybe shyer with your hand. So I'm going to voice this question and I'm going to walk to the back of the room so you can grab me. Yeah. Okay, I got you. Thank you. Okay, great. So given the long history of inequality plaguing societies across the globe, how many years do you think it will take before we see the true shift toward universal design and real accessibility becoming a global standard?
Whatever the number was, it is now 4 years longer. In honest answer to this question, I don't think we're going to arrive at that point, or even if we do, we won't know we've arrived. Equality is just by definition not something that is achieved. Access is not something that is achieved. And again, given the kind of person I am, I just hate that. There is nothing I like better than a list of things to do and checking things off. I really, that is my vibe. That's where I live. And so understanding that concepts that are so dear to my heart, like justice, equity, love, communication, that these are not just open-ended, but necessarily always in motion, always becoming, that's a tough one for me. But it is the case. We are not going to arrive there. We are going to be in the work together. And I think we are going to be full of joy and full of love and full of anger. And we are going to hurt and things are going to suck a lot. And those things will always be unfolding. I don't believe in progress narratives anymore. I don't even believe that things are getting better, except in the sense that we are living with and through joy and with and through our intimacy with each other.
Hi, my name is also Jennifer. I wanted to kind of piggyback off of Michelle's question a little bit because I love the diagram that you showed, but so much of that, and I say this as a Black disabled academic, that to function within that is all of the onus is on the disabled person. And so sort of where the institution comes in, there's power in that, and they may need their own kind of diagram to show what that looks like for them so that, because I think often when you think about what it takes to come together as a collective, it's often that marginalized group that has to do the work. And where can we put people with power whether those are marginalized people or not. Often it's the majority, but where are they in the parallel of your diagram, or should they have their own diagram, or to fill that gap that Michelle is speaking to? Does that make sense?
Do you mean, should people in power have their own diagram or Black disabled people?
People in power.
Oh.
Or are there allies?
No, I'm pausing because that's such a great question.
Yeah.
No, please say what you were going to add.
Or are there allies? Maybe they have a little bit more, because we all have power in different ways, right? I do want to acknowledge that.
Yep.
Like, so often we feel disempowered given our identity, but we often hold power. It may just look different. It doesn't look like white majority power, but it is power.
Yes.
So,
and often it is the power of intimacy,
right,
or the power of lived experience.
right.
Like those are, yes, I, Jennifer, thank you so much. One thing that was hard for me while I was working on Crip Spacetime, and especially while I was revising it and trying to, finally bring it to publication, was I really didn't want to paint, quote unquote, the institution as this kind of monolith, like just a singular thing that we could all be mad at and be like, yeah, we all hate the institution, the end. Because the institution is, I think your question pointed this out much better than what I'm about to say, but there is no the institution. It's me. It's you. It's all of us together. One of my students once defined biopower. I remember this. I wrote it down. It was such a great definition. I asked your typical impossible professor question, which was, what is biopower? Who wants to try to define it? And one of my students said, I think biopower is a way of understanding, I'm not going to get her quote exactly right, but it was something like, she said, it's a system that we all uphold together. And that just really struck me, like the way she expressed the active role of upholding these systems of oppression. So there needs to be a diagram to reflect the ways that institutional power is distributed in those ways. It's not just like the mean people over here and the poor suffering people over there. I have not, however, been able to figure out a more systemic way of imagining that. Like I had never thought of making a diagram for that sort of that side of the equation, and I really should. Now I'm going to try to. What I do have, and these are throughout the book, is little ways of thinking about intervening in moments where we could exercise our power. And, maybe it's in a more lateral relationship, maybe it's in a more top-down kind of relationship. So one of my suggestions, I often make this particular suggestion to when I'm speaking to groups of faculty or administrators, is it's a thought experiment, and the thought experiment is very simple. It's the next time someone tells you they need something, believe them. That was, I know, that was me drop. I would drop this mic, but our ear, it's a very sensitive mic. So this is a challenge I like to put to administrators, faculty members, folks who are often in the position of sort of quote unquote granting accommodations or access to other people. The exercise is simply the next person who says they need something, believe them. And you don't have to do it, but just see what happens if you choose believing someone as your first move when they express a need. Maybe it's your toddler, maybe it's a student, maybe you're an administrator and it's a faculty member who has come to you with something. What happens if you just routinely start believing people who are expressing needs instead of beginning from a place of, well, do you need a lot? Could you maybe need this other thing? Is that need even real? So that's one little move. Another little move I suggest is something that is actually going to be published in that book, Feminist Making. It's an act that I call access priming. Access priming, the concept is still a little messy. And again, it's shamelessly based on my own experience. Access priming is basically offering people help and then ensuring that you have held open a big space for their response. So one of the things that happens to me a lot is people will help me without my asking for it, or they'll help me in a way that's not helpful, like it's physically damaging, for example. So access priming, as I sort of imagine it, is setting the stage for access without assuming that active intervention is needed. So one form of access priming might be Allie saying to me, "Do you want me to move your water to the other side of the podium?" Just offering something, could be big, could be small. But the key part of access priming is not offering to help. It's waiting for the response, which is a weird thing that people usually leave out of offers to help. So you offer your help. Do you want me to move your water bottle? And then you wait to see what the other person says. The other person might be like, "No, that's fine." And then you just trust them. You trust them with the need they have expressed. Now, of course, in the world of access intimacy, it's a little more complicated. You might be getting like a Southern no, like, "No, that's okay," but you're supposed to ask again. So sometimes there are particular dynamics in a relationship. This isn't exactly a foolproof recipe. But the thing that's interesting to me about access priming, and again, this is something I suggest specifically to people who tend to be in positions of power or influence. What happens if you offer to help, but then are really curious about what you get back, rather than offering to help and sort of barging forward with the help in almost the same move? So again, Jennifer, it's such a good question. I don't have the diagram. Now I'm going to think about it. So far, I have little pointillistic ideas, but your question is so well taken. Thank you.
This is Allie again. I am very sorry to say that we have run out of time. So we are now at the stage where I just have to say thank you so much to Margaret for your time and your expertise. Thank you, everybody who joined us on Zoom, everybody who came into the room, our access workers, both in the room and remotely as our captioner, and the Disability Cultural Center, of course, for always hosting and opening such accessible and wonderful space. Please, on your way out, feel free to get some refreshments and snacks as you go so they end up in your bellies and not in the trash. That feels like an appropriate place to. Oh,
There is a worm bin right here.
CC has a feedback form if you'd like to scan.
Thank you. I forgot. I even had a card reminding me. To just revoice that, the DCC, Disability Cultural Center, has a feedback form. We would, speaking of sort of institutional things that help us hold space like this, I imagine.
This is a great way to exercise a little power.
Yes. Please fill out that feedback.
Those things are currency.
Increasingly so, I believe. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you again, Margaret, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, organizers, and thank all of you for coming.